Okay, and we'll get started. And like we were talking about before the class, I am able to send the recordings out. The recordings also, for those of you who aren't already using the resource, remember to use a sharedinheritance.com because these classes are now being posted out there, and all the Job classes will be there. And of course, we have other classes and certainly podcast. You can link to our Spotify and Apple Play podcast that way. Um, so um, anyway, so some good resources there. We've had really good articles. We've got great March articles coming out. So just a plug for that. It's always good for us to be listening to good things. There's a lot of stuff coming at us that we don't need to be hearing, and it's always good for us to remember that we have a lot of good resources and things that we can listen to instead of junk, which is everything else. All right. And we ended last week by, we're in the middle of this passage in chapter 29 where Job is reminiscing about the days past. And, he talks about that not only was his family and wealth part of life, but position of honor and power he had been given due to his relationship with God, that he had profound respect of all sorts of people. He was honored. But he gave God the glory for that. But still, people longed to know him. They were in awe of him. He had a good name, a good report. He could answer to the great and the small, the princes and the nobles. God's people, and we talked about that, in such as Job, really are blessed with opportunities, great opportunities to honor God and do good, giving him the glory as a mark of a special people. And there's nothing wrong with us knowing that we can be wise without pride and knowledgeable with humility. And he served in that state. He talks about how he was the eyes to the blind and he was the legs for the lame. And he not only just gave advice, but he was privileged to be part of the service. He engaged in the process of service. He actually spent his time and his energy that way. He didn't sit in his gilded palaces and just think about things that he wanted for himself, which of course can be what happens many times when all we have is time and money. We begin to turn our thoughts on ourselves. And Job says, I didn't do that. That's not who I was. I used all of the good things that God had given me. And so he sort of continues to evaluate the days of past and the days before his affliction in the next verses. So let's read 18 through 25. Then I said, I shall die in my nest. He's talking about the days where he lived with his children around him, with the blessings of God, with the honor, giving and serving and taking care of everybody. And he says, and I said, I shall die in my nest, multiply my days as the sand. My root is spread out to the waters, and the dew lies all night on my branch. My glory is fresh within me, and my bow is renewed in my hand. Men listened to me and waited and kept silent for my counsel. After my words, they did not speak again, and my speech settled on them as dew. They waited for me as for rain, and they opened their mouth wide as the spring rain. If I mocked at them, they did not believe it, and the light of my countenance they did not cast down. I chose the way for them and sat as chief. So I dwelt as a king in the army, as one who confronts the mourners. And so he continues these thoughts. He understood that even in these wonderful days, even in the days of his prosperity, he understood that nothing was guaranteed. He sort of turns his thoughts here to the fact that he knew in general that he was liable to trouble. That trouble could come upon him. He was never secure in that prosperity. In chapter 3, verse 26, he had said, I'm not in safety, neither had I rest. Yet he had no real particular occasion for fear. He had no reason to think that something that had happened to him would happen to him. He had no more reason than any other man to count upon his days ending, that just like everybody else, and especially those around him, just like them, he had just thought that his days would continue with tranquility and peace. You ever know folks when something happens, something horrible happens, and they say, "I never imagined that this would happen." That's these sentiments that, his life, there was no reason for him to think. He says his days before, having made himself a warm and easy nest, he said he would assume that would be the state in which he dies. That's what his language here is saying. Why would he think otherwise? That was the way life went. It is the way that it goes for all of us. We don't anticipate, especially anticipate to the extent of what had happened to him. He had hoped to not be disturbed, that it would not be taken or removed. He had seen no storm on the horizon, no reason to think otherwise. There are many times in our lives that we stop and think, I'm so blessed that I've not lost certain people, or we're so blessed that we've not had more catastrophe. I'm so blessed that I've never felt real hunger. I'm so blessed that I have in my entire life laid down my head in a bed where I'm not hearing bombs going off around me and chaos around me. And those are things that are particularly special for our culture. And so in the midst of this prosperity, he didn't think that he would not die. He knew that he would die one day, but he didn't worry about imminent death. And I think that that's the way we spend a lot of our days. Though I try to pray every day that the Lord comes quickly, that there will be this great day, and that the saints will receive their crowns, and that resurrection will be final. But at the same time, we don't. Job is saying, I didn't live my life with the worry that this was all going to come to a sudden end. As God had so blessed, he assumed his days would be many as the sand, he says here, that he just thought that that's the way that would be. And as he remained faithful, he believed that God would remain faithful to him. And like I said, these are great lessons for all of us, because we all have been born into a land and in circumstances where we have relative ease with life in many ways. We don't experience the situation or circumstances where we have to watch people die around us a lot. That's not something that is common to us. We're not adjusted to the fact that of infant mortality. We don't see a lot of children and babies die. We are not exposed to those types of things. And so most of the world, that not all the world certainly has these advantages, but most of us live in peace and prosperity without the regular notions of attack in any way. He had a good foundation, he talks about here. His stock was all his own. He hadn't taken something from somebody else deceitfully or unlawfully, so that he would be afraid that they would come and take it away from him. He didn't owe someone something. He had not paid his debtors. He wasn't somebody who was in a situation where they would come and take him. He wasn't threatened. He had security. None of his neighbors made any demands on him. He was healthy and well positioned. He was moving forward as expected in life. He was like a tree whose root is not only spread out, but it's fixed and firm. It kept him steady. It was secure. It was spread out on the waters, which would feed it. It was nourished. There was no reason to think he would not remain fruitful, because his life was such and designed in a way that there was that constant nourishment and provision of security. And so it is something for us to think about, because that is the way a lot of us live. And providence showed favor on him. All around him flourished. His bow also was renewed in his hand. no reason to think that the Chaldeans or the Sabians would come in upon him. He had always been well protected. Everywhere he looked, he saw favor. There was no reason for him to expect such a fate. He was the oracle of his country, the darling of his province. He had the hearts and affections of his neighbors, his subjects, his servants. All admired him. Everybody loved him. He knew that to be true. He remembered those days. His words of the past years had comforted, provided dews of heaven for a parched ground. People wanted to know what he had to say. They waited for him. And it was like a rain that refreshed. It would quench the thirst on the ground of all the people. He was sovereign. He chose out their way. Those in the domain followed him. He steered them, and they deferred to his judgment. He dwelt as a king in the army, giving the orders and directing his ways, and all found comfort in him and his abilities. So that is the description here of what life had been like for him. But now, as we begin this new chapter, melancholy sets in. And he says, but now they mock me. Men younger than I, whose fathers I disdain to put with the dogs of my flock. Indeed, what profit is the strength of their hands to me? Their vigor has perished. They are gaunt from want and famine, fleeing late into the wilderness, desolate and waste, who pluck mallow by the bushes and the broom tree roots for their fruit. They are driven out from among men. They shouted at them as at a thief. They had to live in the clefts of the valleys, in the caves of the earth, and the rocks among the bushes they brayed, under the nettles they nestled. They were the sons of fools, yes, the sons of vile men. They were scourged from the land. These are the people that are taunting him. And now they are taunting song. Yes, I am their byword. They arbor at me. They keep far from me. They do not hesitate to spit in my face, because he has loosed my bowstring and afflicted me. They have cast off restraint before me. At my right hand, the rabble arises. They push away my feet. They raise against me their ways of destruction. They break up my path. They promote my calamity. They have no helper. They come as broad breakers under the ruinous storm. They roll along. And so he's spent a whole chapter or whole text, certainly quite a bit of time talking and lamenting about what he was and what life was when he knew God was actively involved in the blessing of his life. But he says, but now, as he begins this terrible train of thought, that was then, but adversity is here now. I've made a very large and sad complaint of a great disgrace that has now fallen upon me. He's described his journey from the height of honor and reputation to his current state. It was ridiculous, this fall and this present ridicule. He had gone from the highest of high to the lowest of lows. He mentions two things here. He mentions of the meanness of the people who now oppress him, the ones who feel free now to talk of him, to speak ill of him, to make fun of him, to tread on his misfortunes. The scum of the earth have now found me their target, he says. Those who are owed and due no respect, for they are ungodly, lazy, fit for nothing people. He talks about how the young come and mock, mean and despicable. They are so shabby that they're not fit to be seen among his servants. They are so silly that they are not fit to be his employees, and so false that they are not fit to be trusted in the meanest post that he could give them. These are the types of people now who have found joy and jubilation in the fact that this great man has fallen. You know people like that? You know people who watch for somebody to stumble and fall, who are waiting for the great to fall, who themselves have made a mess of their lives, who know nothing about God, who are deceitful and awful, and yet they wait for someone to fall. They and their families were the unprofitable burdens of the earth, he says. They were good for nothing. Even Job and all of his patience and his wisdom could not make anything of them. If anybody could make something of them, Job could. They were not fit for labor, he says. You wouldn't give them a job. They're not fit for labor because they're lazy. It didn't matter if they were youth. They remained youthless. And as children throughout all of their days until they got older. And they, at this point, seem to have the upper hand on Job. And that's what his discussion is. God, even those who are evil, who are lazy, who make a mockery of the blessings of life, who scrounge around for their food. They weren't ready to serve. They weren't ready to starve. To serve. Instead, they would willingly starve. They wouldn't dig. And to beg, they'd be too ashamed. These are just, and if they had brought to necessity, if they were brought to necessity by the providence of God, their neighbors wouldn't have given them anything because they weren't proper objects of charity. Proper objects of charity, this is an interesting lesson for us as Americans, are people who are without, but to no fault of their own. They are the helpless children, those who have lost and are struggling to try to find a job, but lazy, those who won't work. They were brought into these situations and into these straits by their own slothfulness and wastefulness, is what Job is talking about. Nobody would be there for them because they were not those who were in need because they were really in need, and hence they were forced to flee to the desert, both for shelter and substance. They were put in sorry shifts, and they cut the mallow by the bushes. They were glad to eat them. It was food fit for them, Job says. See what hunger will bring men to. We don't even understand half of the world who might not have what we have. Yet those that have abundance ought to think sometimes of those who fare and are under circumstances that they cannot help, that they are in need. We must own the righteousness of God. And we must not miscalculate that there are those who are hungry, who are in rags because they choose to be, because their choices have led them there. And that's what Job is talking about. These are the ones who have come to mock him. And he's not happy about it. This beggarly world is full of the devil's poor, is what is being said here. They're scandalous and wicked people here. Not only the burdens, but the plagues of the places where they lived. They were scoundrels and the scum of the country. They were driven forth from among men, he says. They were such lying, thieving, lurking, mischievous people that the best service the magistrates could give was to get rid of them, to get them out of the country, while the very mob cried that they were thieves. All right. And so an idle fellow is who he's talking about here. A lazy man, one who would deceive to get what they wanted, one who was too proud to beg and yet too lazy to earn. They were forced to dwell in the caves of the earth. And so he says, see what is the lot of these that cry out in the country. They cry of their own conscience against them. They cannot but be in continual terror and confusion. They groan among the trees and smart among the nettles, is what this is talking about. They are stung and they are scratched by their own situations. Where they hope to be sheltered and protected, they find agony and defeat. They had nothing at all in them to recommend them to any man's esteem. That's who is now torturing Job. They were vile, a kind without fame, people that nobody could give a good word for or a good wish for, banished. But they celebrated his misfortune. They made themselves merry and happy, singing songs about his grief. They are singing songs. Verse 8, they are the sons of fools. They are vile men. They are scourged from the land. And now I am their taunting song. They abhor me. They keep far from me. They don't hesitate to spit in my face. They shunned him. They made a loathsome spectacle out of him. They hated him, ran from him. They expressed the greatest scorn and indignation from him, spit upon him, kicked him, made a sport of him. They were very malicious against him, and they preyed on him. They blamed him. They falsely accused him. They triumphed in his calamity, called attention to it. And they did all this in numerous and violent ways, as a dam that was broken and unleashed. And all this due to his situation that he could do nothing about. It was not due to the wrath of the soul or the righteousness of goodness of man, and not due to the worth of the soul or the righteousness and the goodness of man. He has found himself in a horrible situation. He goes on to say, terrors are turned upon me. They pursue my honor as the wind, and my prosperity has passed like a cloud, and now my soul is poured out because of my plight. The days of affliction take hold of me. My bones are pierced in me at night, and my gnawing pains take no rest. By great force my garment is disfigured. It binds me about as the collar of my coat. He has cast me into the mire, and I have become like dust and ashes. I cry out to you, but you do not answer me. I stand up and you regard me. But you have become cruel to me. With the strength of your hand you oppose me. You lift me up to the wind and cause me to rise on it. You spoil my success. For I know that you will bring me to death and to the house of the appointed for all living. Surely he would not stretch out his hand against the heaps of the ruin, if they cry out when he destroys it. Have I not wept for him who was in trouble? Has not my soul grieved for the poor? But when I looked for good, evil came to me. And when I waited for light, then came darkness. My heart is in turmoil and I cannot rest. Days of affliction confront me. I go about mourning, but not in the sun. I stand in the assembly and cry out for help. I am a brother of jackals and a companion of ostriches. My skin grows black and falls from me. My bones burn with fever. My harp is turned into mourning, and my flute to the voice of those who weep. He continues this awful, bitter complaint. And here's what he complains of. He says the affliction had seized him. It had surprised him, actually. It had surprised him. He didn't expect or make any provisions for everything that had happened. His great sorrow was always preying on him and upon his spirit with no intercession at all. From morning to evening and all through the nights, his affliction was never ending, and always before him. Without any sun, he had nothing to take comfort in. He walked out of the sun. If he had joined the congregation, he couldn't hide his pain. And therefore, he had become a brother to the dragons, to the owls, to the ostriches, choosing solitude and retirement, hiding and alone. The terror and the trouble of his heart and his soul was by far the worst part of his affliction. If he looked ahead, he feared what might happen in the future. If he tried to escape the afflictions, it would remind him that they were still there. Wherever he turned, whatever he did in his situation seemed to not work. My soul, the principal part of a man, our glory, our more excellent than our bodies, was threatened and wounded and broken, is what he complains of here. My bodily diseases are horrible. He was full of pain that went to his bone, to all of his bones. Sword was piercing him all the way to his bone. Constant fever, burnt with fever, full of sores. Verse 20, his skin was black. His blood had settled. His sores were scabbed over. Even his garment had its color changed because of these continual boils. He was in horrible shape physically, more than any of us have ever experienced or imagined. And worst of all, God seemed to be his active enemy in all of this. Verse 20, I cry unto thee. I stand up and I cry and wait for an answer. But you don't regard or you don't perceive that I'm there. Verse 21, you have been cruel to me. He is unjustly assuming that God is the author of all of this, just as his friends had concluded. Therefore, Job is receiving punishment. And of course, we know that God was not the source of these afflictions. Oh, this is just so depressing. So his expectation and hope now, and all consideration of this, is that God will finally end everything for him. These are sentiments that he has expressed over and over and over, that in death he will receive relief. And without death comes no relief. That God would take him out of the earth. If I be made to ride upon the wind, I can count upon not other than to break my neck shortly. And he speaks as if God had no other design for him than that in all of his dealings with him. I know that thou wilt bring me with so much more terror to death, though I might have been brought thither without all of this ado. For it is in this house appointed for all the living, that is the grave. A narrow, dark, cold, ill-fashioned house, this little house that all the living finally come to, appointed for the living. It will be our residence where we will rest and be safe. And he knew that God surely would bring him there. And there are two things that aggravated his trouble and made it even worse. One, that it was a very great disappointment when I looked for good, for more good, or at least for the countenance of what I had, then evil came. A lot of people can relate to this disappointment. So uncertain are the things of life, right? The worldly enjoyments, folly for us to feed upon them with great expectations of these things on the earth. And then two, he says that it was a very great change in his condition. Verse 31, my harp is not only laid by and hung upon the willow trees, but it is turned to mourning, and my organ into the voice of those that weep. In his prosperity, he had taken the timbrel and the harp, and he had rejoiced at the organ. But now all of that has turned on him, that those days have been so altered that there is no laughter, that there is only mourning, that there is no joy, that there is only heaviness. And so he continues to complain. That's the way he lives his life. And finally, there is something in the midst of all this that he's able to find comfort in, and that is death. To end all of his afflictions, where God will meet him, this true grace and mercy be given, God's hand of wrath lifted. There his soul would be safe and happy in the world of the spirits, and those far behind mourn, those in the grave rejoice. It is interesting to think about Job's last words here as we begin the next chapter, which we will do now. Matthew Henry says that Job had often protested his integrity in general. Here, he does it in particular instances, not in a way of condemnation, for he does not here proclaim his good deeds, but in his own just and necessary vindication, to clear himself from those crimes with which his friends had falsely charged him, which is a debt every man owes to his own reputation. And so he'll end at least the text that we've been given of his words, and possibly his final thoughts before God will finally appear, or before Elihu comes and speaks, and then God finally decides that he will intervene for him. Job's friends had been very particular in their impeachments of him. in their articles of impeachments. And therefore, he will do the same as he gives his defense against himself. They had produced no witnesses against him. All of this time, there were no witnesses that could verify that he had treated anybody unkindly, that he had taken things that were not his, that he had deceived men around him, that he had lived a hypocritical life. They had no witnesses. They couldn't prove any of the things that they had accused him of. And so he'll go into this state of really justifying a day in court for himself, that nothing had been proved by them, and that he deserved to be able to stand up for his own reputation. Like Matthew Henry says, it was a necessary vindication to clear himself from the crimes that his friends had falsely accused him of. That's where he is at this point. He doesn't know why these things are happening. He doesn't know that anything will end before God takes him for death, but he will justify himself. He has not been a hypocrite. He wants to prove that he is not guilty of the things, that his heart had always been based on good principles, that his intentions had always been to glorify God. He talks about a list of things here. We'll just go through these things in this text here as we go through chapter 31. I've made a covenant with my eyes. Why then should I look upon a young woman? For what is the allotment of God from above and the inheritance of the Almighty from on high? Is it not destruction for the wicked and disaster for the workers of iniquity? Does he not see my ways and count all my steps? If I have walked with falsehood, or if my foot has hastened to deceive, let me be weighed on honest scales, that God may know my integrity. If my step has turned from the way, or my heart has walked after my eyes, or if any spot adheres to my hand, then let me sow and another eat. Yes, let my harvest be rooted out. So, against the accusations that have been laid out before him, throughout the months or years of the conversations that he's had with his friends who have come to try to help him in his present state, he will just calmly talk about how his life really has been and the intentions of his heart. He begins with perhaps the sin that, one of the sins that God hates the most. He says, not only have I kept myself clear from adultery, but I have not even ever defiled a woman. I've had no mistress, no concubine, just a wife who he had remained faithful to and clung to. She wasn't the wisest or the best of counselors at all times. We know that from her only statement that she makes or is accredited for. But he loved her as he should, as God had directed. He talks about how he had actually even watched against such behavior, kept the covenant of God and man. And not because of man, not because he would be in trouble with man. For later, he talks about the fact that actually this is a sin that is rampant and has always been rampant in every age and in all times. And that many times can be escaped. It escapes the punishment of man. He says, not because of man, but God. The fear of the wrath and the curse of God is why he has maintained his pure behavior. And that's what we all have to be able to say about our actions. That no matter what other people say, he says, I have remained faithful to my covenant relationship with God. For what is the allotment from God from above? There is no portion, no inheritance, no true happiness for a soul unless it is with God. What comes from above, what's on high. And if we don't do that, we just find ourselves in a world and in a culture that will find many people to tell you that your misbehavior is okay. And what Job says is, my allotment is with God above. I'm in a relationship with God, and it has driven my core values and behavior my entire life. In verse 3, it is a sin that incurs destruction. Fools make a mock of this sin. Wicked people are easily drawn into this behavior with little or strange punishment. But there is no portion of God that can be that can be part of this behavior. Or activities of adultery can be hidden. We've talked about this. I mean, he even addressed this when his friends accused him of such things. But Job says, it's not hidden from God, who is my covenant relationship. For God sees all. And not only does he see, but he takes notice and he counts our steps, keeping account of all of our sin and behavior. Job says, men and women who act this way are accountable to God. And that's why I have not acted in this way. In verse 5, he begins a new thought. He had been careful to walk righteously to avoid sin. He didn't trust in lies. He didn't look for a good bargain or a deceitful venture. He wasn't a get-rich-quick. He wasn't prone to those types of schemes where there are questionable motives or questionable actions. He was not a wheeler-dealer. His wealth was not acquired by vanity. His steps never turned out of the way of justice, of fair dealings. Verse 7, he not only took care not to walk in a constant course in a way of deceit, but he did not so much as take one step out of the way of honesty. His heart did not walk after his eyes, he says. This is, he did not covet what he saw and then take it. And he's confident in this honesty that he's given. He's confidently and honestly assessing himself. I do think that true children of God who are wise enough to judge themselves by God's words are able to know their own hearts. I think that's what Paul is begging us to do. Take the word of God, let it do, open heart surgery on us. Let it see us. Let us see ourselves in it. And then we can properly assess, and we can then be confident in the relationship we have with God as we walk in the light. We know our weaknesses. We know the forgiveness of God. We know righteousness. We're not people who are afraid and scared to death to die because we're just not sure how we'll be judged. God does not want his people to not understand his promises and be confident in those. And that's what Job is expressing here. It is in those who are not anxious to weigh themselves by the word of God that then there is the confidence. The danger comes when we have not properly assessed ourselves, when we know that we're not really truthful, even with our own selves, but that God knows us. Then comes the dread of the trial, but he doesn't fear a trial. Job is just simply willing to forfeit all of his cargo on board if there can be found anything prohibited, any contraband on board, he says. If there's anything, then let me sow and another eat. He is so confident. Anything but what he came by honestly. Verse 8. Let my children be uprooted, but I know that I am not guilty, and any trial would prove that. And of course, that's what he is beginning to really ramp up his language to beg for. If my heart has been enticed by a woman, or if I've lurked at my neighbor's door, then let my wife grind for another, and let others bow down over her. For that would be wickedness. Yes, it would be iniquity deserving of judgment. For that would be fire that consumes to destruction, would root out all my increase. If I have despised the cause of my male or female servant, when they complained against me, what then shall I do when God rises up, when he punishes? How shall I answer him? Did not he who made me in the womb make them? Did not the same one fashion us in the womb? He makes 2 points here. He had great hatred. There's no question for the sin of idolatry. He cannot stand it. He talks of it as a horrible thing. He said he did not ever wrong his marriage bed. He never even kept a maid or a concubine, which during these days we begin to see in the scriptures. He was so careful not to make injury of his own neighbor's marriage bed, that he watched over even his neighbors, that he would not put his neighbor in jeopardy of this type of punishment. He was very clear about this sin. He did not covet his neighbor's wife. His heart was not deceived by a woman. The beauty of another man's wife had not kindled him to unchaste desires. He was not moved to the allurements. His wife was never in danger of him putting her in jeopardy. And he also says that he never laid at wait at his neighbor's doors to give opportunity to even stir up conversation or talk, that this sin is abhorrible. He had great hate for this sin. And then he talks about that he also had great confidence in the kindness that he had also showed those within his household. Not only had he not taken any of the women in his household, which was what was beginning to be the practice during those days. We even see Sarah and Abraham, who would have lived among these days, who were susceptible to that train of thought as well, when Sarah offers Hagar to Abraham. But he speaks now of his kindness, that he had this great tenderness towards his servants, and he ruled them with a very gentle hand. He says, not only did I control myself when it came to women, but I controlled myself when it came to my servants and to the people that worked for me and to my household, and I managed it well. And it was evidenced in this sincerity that he had grace to govern. And you could see this within his own household. His servants loved him. He did not despise the cause of his handmaid, of his manservant, or his maidservant when they confronted him, when they disagreed with him. He said, when they complained against me, I didn't mistreat them. He said they could come to me with an argument, and I would listen to them. He would patiently hear what they had to say. You know, we snap immediately when somebody disagrees with us, or when somebody who we have authority over is not acting the way. But he says, I didn't act that way. I was completely fair. If they complained of any hardship that he put upon them, he wouldn't browbeat them. He didn't tell them not to talk or to hold their tongues, or that they weren't allowed to say anything. He gave them a leave to tell their stories. He addressed their grievances as far as it appeared they had a right on their side. He was tender with them, not only when they served him and pleased him, but when they contended with him. He said it wasn't just the servants who were easy to get along with. When he was tempted to be harsh with his servants, verse 15, to deny them their right, to turn a deaf ear for their reasoning, this thought came very sensibly to his mind. Look at the thought. Did not he make me, he who made me, also make them? I'm a creature as well as he, as well as the servant. And my being is derived and depending on God just as theirs are. He partakes in the same nature that I do and is the work of the same hand. Have we not all the same Father? And so, of course, the thoughts here take us to how well we do with the creation of the Almighty, how patient we are with others when they disagree with us, when they're not as mature, when they don't understand the things that we understand, when they're downridden, when they are hard to love. How do we do with God's creation? And Job here is defending himself. He says, I did well to even those who would bring contentious thoughts to me. I've kept the poor from their desire. If I have kept the poor from their desire, or caused the eyes of the widow to fail, or eaten my morsel by myself, so that the fatherless could not eat it. From my youth I reared him as a father, and my mother's womb I guided the widow. If I have seen anyone perish for lack of clothing, or any poor man without covering, if his heart has not blessed me, and if he has not warmed with the fleece, was not warmed with the fleece of my sheep, if I have raised my hand against the fatherless, when I saw I had help in the gate, then let my arm fall from my shoulder. Let my arm be torn from its socket, for the destruction from God is a terror to me, and because of his magnificence, I cannot endure. Eliphaz particularly had charged Job with being unmerciful to the poor. He had accused him of not helping those who were in need. He had specifically talked in chapter 22 about thou hast withheld bread from the hungry, stripped the naked of their clothing, and sent widows away empty. Of course, Job had immediately defended himself against such thought. But this is the testimony of Job's conscience. This is what he knew of himself. This is what he says he had not done. He enlarges upon this matter. I would guess that it bothered him greatly to be accused of this. He had never been one who did not want to do good to them when there was an occasion to the utmost of his ability. He was always compassionate to the poor. He has defended himself before and careful of them, especially those who could not help themselves. In those days, of course, we know widows were left without a way to feed themselves or work. They had no way to take care of themselves. And the fatherless, the ones who were orphans, they were destitute. He was always ready to grant their desires and answer their expectations. We see in verse 16, if a poor man begged a kindness of his, he was ready to gratify him. If he didn't perceive the widow's mournful craving, and that she expected alms for him, he was confident that he would ask her. He was compassionate enough to give it. Never caused the widow to fail, he says here. Remember, in the last text, he's already told us just in the couple of chapters before that he was the eyes to the blind and the lame, the legs to the lame. He put a respect upon the poor. He did them honor. He took the fatherless children to eat with him at his own table, that they should fare as he fared, be familiar with him. He would show himself pleased with their company. Verse 17 says he took them in. He reared them as a father, and he accepted them into his home. They were as family to him. He says from his youth, from his mother's womb, he had a tenderness about him, a compassion woven into his nature. His parents perhaps had displayed the same goodness. He began his times to do good ever since he could remember. He had always felt for the fatherless and the widows and the children under his care. His parents had taught him perhaps to pity and to relieve. He said, I've done this from my youth. It is my nature I can't watch somebody be taken advantage of. I've treated them as my own household, as my own family. And furthermore, he says that he was never an accessory to the wrongdoings of any of the poor. He was kind. They were his favorite. If he had raised up his hand against the fatherless, he was ready for punishment. He had never threatened them. He had never frightened them. He had never made fun of them. He had never talked to somebody else poorly about them. Said, "Good grief, you know what is that, or what's the deal with that?" He had shown an interest in them. He would enable them to do good. He sat at the gate and raised his hand and gave his hands to them. Those who had no power, he gave love and mercy and goodness to, because he had the power and they didn't. He sat at the gate and he had the power, and yet he never did anything but kindness. And he says, just let my arm fall off if I have been in such a state. I'd rather lose my arm that has been raised up against some fatherless, someone less fortunate than me. If I've ever acted arrogantly or inappropriate with someone in need, just take that arm of mine off. Take away my pride. Let my arm fall off, because if I was ever tempted to act in such a way. And then in verse 23, he says, I just stood in awe of the majesty. If I ever was tempted to think such a thing, as great a God above me, he says, the highest of position, the magnificence I cannot endure. Let him judge me, for he knows my heart. If I had made gold my hope, or said to find gold you are my confidence, if I've rejected because my wealth was great and because my hand had gained so much, if I have observed the sun when it shines, or the moon moving in brightness, so that my heart has been secretly enticed and my mouth has kissed my hand, this also would be an iniquity deserving of judgment. For I would have denied God who is above, if I rejoiced at the destruction of him who hated me, or lifted myself up from evil when evil found him. Indeed, I have not allowed my mouth to sin by asking for a curse on his soul. If the men of my tent have not said, where is there that has not been satisfied with his meat? But no sojourner had to lodge in the street, for I have opened my doors to the traveler. He's never set his heart to the wealth of the world, nor did he take things of it for his own happiness or greed. He had gold. He was rich and had so much. It had been a blessing to Job, but it did not become his priority, so that he was not faithful to God. He protests against that. That is not true. It is not true. And if you do this, you are very unwise, he says. You're an enemy of your own self. He protests that he had never given worship and glory to a creature, which are due to God only. He was not guilty of idolatry, verses 26 through 28. In fact, he had never so much as bowed a knee to another God. He had never fell to earth and worshiped the sun, which was very common. But he had kept his heart, his eye, his lips clean from sin. In fact, when he looked at the lights of heaven, he should by faith look through them, beyond them, to the Father of lights. He didn't compliment the deities, the gods that the people around him had worshiped. He hated these things. These were sinful to him. Verse 28. They were iniquity, to be punished by the judge. Idolatry, the preference of anything above God, the great affront to our creation, the high treason, worthy of great punishment. He protests that he was far from doing or designing mischief to any. He didn't delight or desire for anybody to hurt. Even his worst enemy, he had never wished anything bad upon. the forgiving of those who do us evil. It seems was an Old Testament duty. The Pharisees didn't seem to understand this, but this is the focus of this. Job understood this. Job was far from revenge. He not only did not seek revenge, but he did not even rejoice in bad luck. That's hard. There are many who will not seek revenge, who will not get involved in the fall, but will love watching an enemy suffer or fall or be afflicted. But Job says that was not true of him. There were many who hated him, laughed at him in his state, rejoiced in his fate. He has violently urged them to seek revenge, but he kept clear of these suggestions. Verse 31, the men of his tabernacle, in his home, in his domain, his servants, those around him, were so enraged by Job's enemies who hated him. They would have eaten them, but he had not taken part in those protests, in that activity, and in that thought. He had never been even unhospitable to strangers. The stranger lodged not in the street, as angels might lately have done in the streets of Sodom, if you remember that story. Job said, no, I never was forgetful to entertain and to take in those who would dwell in the streets, for I had a home. And because I have a home, I considered those who did not. That's a good example for us. He served others well. He opened his doors to the travelers, as so should we. All right. And the very ending then of the last of Job's words, and then we'll stop our lesson for tonight. I'm going to finish up real quickly here. Let's just read this. If I have covered my transgression as Adam by hiding my iniquity in my bosom, because I feared the great multitude and dreaded the contempt of families, so that I kept silent, it did not go out of the door. Oh, that I had one to hear me. Here is my mark. Oh, that the Almighty might answer me, that my persecutor had written a book, and surely I would carry it on my shoulder and bind it on me like a crown. I would declare to him the number of my steps, like a prince I would approach him. In my land cries out against me, if my land cries out against me, and its furrows weep together, if I have eaten its fruit without money, or caused its owner to lose their lives, then let thistles grow instead of wheat, and weeds instead of barley. All right. So this is his begging God for his day in court. We have here now his protest against those who have accused him falsely. He is begging for a day in court. He first talks about, again, his biggest complaint, and that is that he is not a hypocrite, the general crime that he's been accused of. He is not hidden as Adam in the cloak of profession, in the profession of religion. He had kept no secret sin. No, Job says, I never did that. I never covered my transgressions as Adam's. Never did I hide myself with fig leaves. I have not been a hypocrite. I am not a coward, secondly. Verse 34, I did not fear the great multitude. All that Job knew that he was a man of undaunted resolution, that he had professed boldly to not be a hypocrite. He had never caved in to admitting something that was not true. He was not a liar. He was not afraid. He didn't fear men in his defense of God and everything that he knew. He had been blamed for violence and oppression, wrongdoing to his poor neighbors. He says, I was not guilty of these things. He talks about how he wishes that his friends had written a book, written it down. I wish you had just written it down so that I would have something that I could use to in court to say, this is what I've been accused of. These are the accusations, so that I could prove that they are wrong. It would have pleased me had you just written it, all of the things that had happened to Job and all of the things that he has now been accused of, to add to his afflictions. He says, I wish it were all written in a book so I could take it into my courtroom, lay it out before God, and say, here's the answer to this. Here's the answer to this. Here's the answer to this. The defendant is ready to take his appearance, to make his appearance, and to give his accusers all the time in the world to debate before a judge who is righteous. He wants God to appear so that the wrongs can be righted, so that vindication can come. He wants vindication for himself. He would declare the number of his steps. He would lay out the history of his life. He would protest against the afflictions. He would not hide or be hypocritical as he had been accused. And so the words end here of Job. He's now said all that he can say in answer to his friends. And he begs for this day before a bench with a judge who will answer righteously against all the accusations that these friends have laid before him. All right, so we will end there, and next class we're going to talk about Elihu and what he has to say. Let me stop the recording.